I'm Baker-Lampe, and I'd like to welcome you to my teaching studio. Here I teach all ages and all levels, but I only take 10 students at a time, so right now the kids I have are mainly late intermediate to advanced. I do have a couple of adults. Over the years, I've been blessed to receive a number of transfer students who've come in with a myriad of, how shall we say, interesting technical and musical issues. And I'd like to focus on one of those issues today. The objective of this lecture is to address the needs and the issues of students who play beautifully by ear, both technically and artistically, but have never mastered the art of reading music. At least not to any real level of proficiency. Granted, such a student, particularly an older and seemingly more advanced one, may not be a regular occurrence in our studios. And quite often, a pianist who's gotten accustomed to playing by ear completely is reluctant to try and catch their eyes up. Or perhaps they just don't see a need. More than that, a pianist who's older and has always played by ear can develop a tendency to become very intimidated, even fearful at the sight of the printed page. The more complicated the music looks, the more intimidated and the more fearful the pianist becomes. This is a very difficult issue to address, but we should be ready within our studios with some kind of plan, just in case we're approached by such a pianist asking for help. As it does happen, I was recently reminded of that when I was approached. Now, my approach to this situation is to take baby steps. That is, start with very simple patterns involving a few notes around middle C, and moving stepwise from the beginning, reading while moving. When steps become more comfortable, then we move in thirds, then in fourths, and so on. For many of these students, the adult beginner materials available to us are actually moving a little too fast, and they're a little more difficult to read. I've had very good luck using the Chose Piano Library, edited by Keith Snell. This is the beginning level, and it does exactly what I described. Starts with C, works its way out. And if reading's the primary concern, then an approach that works like this, mainly by interval and mainly by pattern, is usually the best choice for us. Now, that having been said, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. There is no quick fix to this problem. In fact, we're looking at weeks, maybe months of tedious step-by-step work. And there is a clear and present danger that the student over time will become impatient or just tired of the process, or just tired of the rate at which they're making progress or not making progress. Now, for that reason, it's important to plan ahead. When the time comes, what will be the first actual piece of music that we'll be able to read, or that we'll attempt to read? Near the playing level of the student, not overwhelming. What will be our first initial reading experiment? And then what might come after that? Is there a particular piece maybe that inspired the student who plays by ear to want to learn to read? Quite often this is the case. What I do is look for shorter, more repetitive, pattern-oriented, easy to read by interval pieces. But I always involve the student in my thought process because we want to stay with the student's likes and dislikes as best we can. Now, what follows are a very few suggestions based on my current work with an adult student who perfectly fits the criteria for this project. These literature choices that I made are based largely on her abilities, her needs, and her preferences. And so we begin. After weeks of reading short exercises by pattern and interval, Our student is now ready to embark upon their first journey into reading an actual piece of music. The first choice may well be the most important choice we can make in the entire process. The piece must provide elements which keep the student interested and keep them engaged, while not allowing them to become discouraged or frustrated. At this point, I would recommend something that leans in the direction of minimalism. And my choice for this project is Metamorphosis 1 by American composer Philip Glass. First published in 1988, Metamorphosis 1 is the first in a set of 5 pieces entitled Metamorphosis. The piece opens with a progression of blocked chords, beginning with an E minor triad. The following chords are created by simply changing a note. So, from E minor to G major in second inversion, to C major 7, and ending with C7, this time changing the other 2 notes. The student may not be able to identify all of those chords yet by name, but they will see the simple changes in notes between the chords on the page, like so. And they will associate the changes they see on the page with the harmonic changes they hear. Now, this opening progression represents the first of 3 patterns that make up the body of this piece. This progression is followed by 4 measures of an ostinato on the tonic triad, E minor. This is the second pattern. And the first 2 patterns repeat in that order before moving on. The third pattern is a simple but lovely right-hand melody comprised of downward slurs at the third. Over the ostinato, which lies in turn over a descending bass line. Now this passage is played 3 times, and then the entire piece thus far is repeated twice. So the student has 3 patterns to read and plenty of repetition in which to practice their reading. Of course, following the final repetition, Glass adds a coda comprised of slight variation on the opening chord progression. This pattern is played 3 times, followed by 4 measures of the E minor ostinato at a slower tempo, which is also played 3 times. And then it fades away. The entire piece, with repeats, is about 6 minutes, so it's not overly long, but it's long enough to provide our student with plenty of reading practice. Of course, with so much repetition, it's highly unlikely that the student will need to be actively reading by the time they get to the repeats. One way to keep emphasis on reading skills, rather than on the auditory prowess, is to refrain from playing the piece when first introducing it. And I never play pieces for my students for that reason. Instead, let the student create their own auditory reference, 1 pattern at a time, helping the student to break the piece into small, manageable sections and to scan the score for patterns that repeat or that reappear later can give the student a manageable plan for approaching a piece of several pages with less anxiety. All in all, I believe this piece provides an excellent first reading experience. And now, let's listen to a performance of Metamorphosis 1 by Philip Glass. Now that the proverbial ice has been broken and our student has successfully learned their first piece without total reliance on what they hear, it's time to try something a little more challenging and perhaps a little more traditional. But where shall we look? Haydn? Mozart? Beethoven, perhaps? Finding a suitable classical and early Romantic piece can be very difficult when we're looking outside the body of pedagogical literature from that period. Understand, I hold that literature in high regard, but the subjects of this study are, for the most part, older, some adults, and they have more experience. So what they need is appropriately challenging literature that does not present too many reading difficulties, and yet does not sound like it was written for a child. A tall order for certain. So, for my second selection, I turn to the dance cycles of Franz Schubert. Now, the piece of choice is the third in the set of Noble Waltzes, Deutsch 969. This binary waltz, written in C major, is the longest in the set of 12. And while it's certainly more involved than the glasswork, it presents little to nothing in the way of intimidating features. The left hand is a simple ostinato, once again. And the focus of the right hand is almost entirely on stepwise movement. It scales, doubled at the octave, which may look a little intimidating at first, but is very easily rectified. Now, with the inner sixth, we do have a bit of a technical challenge. Keep in mind, it's a good time to practice arm relaxation, hand relaxation, and proper floating technique for octaves. All of that having been said, this piece presents the student with an opportunity to practice stepwise reading, octave reading, and ostinato review, as well as tension and relaxation techniques and slurring. A worthy endeavor for certain. With all that in mind, let's listen to Franz Schubert's Noble Waltz No. 3, Deutsch 969. It should go without saying that in order to get a complete, well-rounded music education, one would be studying more than just a single piece of music at one time. Even when it's not comfortable with the process of reading music, a student still needs to be doing other things to support that. Attention still must be paid to the study of technique, for instance. And because correction of severe reading deficiencies is our primary focus here, the incorporation of applicable music theory concepts is imperative. Integrating those concepts directly into the study of a particular piece serves two purposes. First, the concepts themselves are given a true purpose in the eyes of the student. Secondly, the student is given a logical structure within which to break down and study a seemingly complicated piece. Take, for instance, Chopin's Prelude, Opus 28, No. 4 in E minor. This is an incredibly popular piece. We all know it. There's a good chance your student has heard it too. But this prelude provides us with a great vehicle for the study of a myriad of theoretical concepts. Let's start with rhythm. Cut time versus common time. The piece is in cut time. So what's the tempo? Where's the pulse, actually? Now let's start with a little bit of what happens in the left hand. requires the even counting of a rhythmic ostinato. And about that accompaniment, is it merely a series of chords on straight eighth notes? Or is it a thinly veiled polyphony? That might be an interesting discussion to have. One could spend a great deal of time covering chromatic movement, which is vital to so many Chopin works. Have the student play the opening melody, just to see what they think. Let them hear the ascending and descending half steps as they read them on the page. Now, have them block the left-hand chords, playing only the changes so they can see and hear and feel each one. First chord, next measure. The one potentially intimidating passage occurs at the stretto between measures 16 and 19. We have jumps, and we have larger chords, and they're moving more than stepwise. But by the time the student picks up this prelude, they should be past much of their trepidation. If their body language tells you otherwise, then it might be well to start with that passage and work it through first before going on to the rest of the piece. I could talk for hours on this piece, but time constraints will prevent us from delving further into this fascinating work. So, how many other ideas come to your mind as we listen? Here's a performance of Prelude Opus 28, number 4, by Frédéric Chopin. If we look carefully at our list of musical choices so far, we quickly notice that we've included nothing prior to the beginning of the 19th century. This may not be a problem, given that we're trying to consider our students' desires while addressing the reading issues at hand. It would be nice, however, to offer them some small sample of pre-classic keyboard music. Who knows? They might come to appreciate the change in style and perhaps develop the urge to explore that period a little further. As it happens, I recently taught a sonata by Domenico Scarlatti that just might serve our purposes. This particular sonata presents the student with an interesting and somewhat challenging melody in the right hand over a very simple rhythmic ostinato, not a far cry from what the students already mastered in the left. The somewhat drone-like accompaniment figure is very easy to read and navigate, even when they add the second note. This allows the students to concentrate on the scales, the arpeggiated passages, and navigate the ornaments that they're now faced with in the right hand. While this piece does represent a considerably greater challenge than the previous examples, it should not prove overwhelming to the student if we follow our process that we followed all along. Break the piece into manageable sections, read it through one hand at a time when necessary. Take each element separately and work it through, learning to read it. In other words, take baby steps, one small step at a time. Sonata is Sonata in A, Kirkpatrick 208 or Longo 238 by Domenico Scarlatti. comes to a close, I would like to offer the aspiration of my newest young adult student, who was in fact the main inspiration for this project. She was actually not familiar with this piece until she heard me practicing it the day she came for her first lesson, and her reaction was, "Oh, I want to play that." Well, that moment became the beginning of an excellent working relationship, and that piece, the Grieg Notturno, became the top of her bucket list. I alluded earlier to the importance of involving students in one's own thought processes about choosing music. And this student told me that she likes music that's, in her words, flowy, fluid, free. The Notturno certainly fits the criteria, although it'll be some time before she'll be totally comfortable reading it. I will say, though, that as quickly as she's adapting to the idea of reading by interval and by pattern, and as quickly as she seems to be losing her trepidation, it could happen sooner than we think. Now, as to the nocturne itself, the only concept within that we haven't covered so far is the duplet over triplet rhythmic figure that dominates the entire piece. I found the easiest way to master this figure, especially with students who have counting problems, is with a simple mnemonic device. Not very hard, 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 not very hard. I know I make it look easy, but this concept is still not completely simple to grasp. And it takes a lot of practice, but the mnemonic device does help considerably. And once the duplet-triplet rhythm is mastered, then the rest of the piece should come quite easily. I hope that today's lecture has yielded some food for thought. One takeaway that I would leave you with is that a student who plays well completely by ear can be taught to read. The desire on the student's part has to be there, but they can be taught if we, as teachers, are willing to take all the time necessary to be very patient and to do whatever it takes to catch these students' eyes up to their ears. Thank you for listening, and we'll close with a performance of the Notturno, Opus 54, number 4, by Edvard Grieg.